Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special event. This is a difficult period for everyone who cares about Palestine and the state of the world. But our difficulties pale in significance compared to those of the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. During the last 15 months, we have witnessed unprecedented violence against Palestinians in Gaza and a calculated attempt to erase anything that can sustain life. Homes, roads, hospitals, universities, schools, bakeries, water sanitation plants, and the targeting of journalists, medical staff, and academics. The Lancet study and other analysis suggest that the real number of deaths in Gaza may reach up to 180 deaths. This includes both direct casualties from military actions and indirect deaths caused by the collapse of healthcare, food insecurity, waterborne diseases, and lack of shelter. Once the ceasefire was reached in Gaza, the Israeli army moved to focus on the West Bank, applying the same approach. Recent Israeli army operations in the West Bank, particularly in the Jenin refugee camp, have resulted in significant destruction and the displacement of thousands of residents. The camp, once home to around 3,490 families, now resembles a ghost town due to the extensive damage and evacuations. The situation in Tulkarem is also terrible, with displacement of approximately 75% of the residents of the refugee camp. Since the inauguration of Trump as the president of the US, Israel is even more emboldened in the violence it uses, and most European governments continue to allow the violence, if not actively supporting it by sending arms. But today our focus will be on the mental impact of this extreme violence. We have the honor of hosting Dr. Samah Jabr, a Palestinian psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and writer who until recently served as the head of the mental health unit at the Palestinian Ministry of Health. Her work focuses on addressing both personal and collective traumas stemming from life under occupation and conflict. Beyond her clinical and administrative work, Dr. Jabr is also widely known as the author of Beyond the Front Lines, columns from a Palestinian psychiatrist and psychotherapist under occupation. A book that offers a rare and thought-provoking glimpse into the psychological experiences of those living in this complex reality. Dr. Jabr gained international recognition for her unique contribution to understanding of trauma's effect and the resilience of the human spirit that emerges in its wake. Her lecture today is titled From Collective Trauma to Healing Justice, the Urgent Call for Solidarity with Palestine. We have a bit more than an hour. Dr. Jabr will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it for your questions. So, Dr. Jabr, we are very happy to have you with us. Thank you for making the time, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this generous introduction, and thank you for the organizers for continuing your solidarity with Palestine. The ceasefire is good news, but at the same time, as you mentioned, the atrocities continue in silence, and the plans for the erasure of the Palestinian cause and the transfer of Palestinian people continue. Today is the an important moment in Palestinian history, with a contemporary Balfour Declaration coming from Trump this time, talking about cleaning out Gaza and creating a Riviera for wealthy people in the world. So solidarity is still urgent, and thank you again for centralizing the Palestinian cause. Colleagues, by the end of this talk, participants will be able to comprehend the profound impact of colonial trauma on Palestinian communities, including its historical roots, ongoing manifestations, and intergenerational effects, and identify practical strategies to support the healing, resilience, and recovery of the Palestinian individuals and communities, and examine the role of global solidarity in advancing healing justice for Palestinians, and explore ways to contribute to collective efforts for equity and restoration. But let me first start by sharing a few examples of my clinical work over the past year. I have observed through my work as a clinician over the past 20 years that the occupation is present in my clinical consultations, but there was a change in the presentation over the past year. I come from Jerusalem. I work in the West Bank. I see people from all over Palestine, from the West Bank and Jerusalem mainly, but people with Israeli citizenship, 48 geographical area, come to see me. And also I work with Palestinians. I work remotely with Palestinians from Gaza and with Palestinians living outside the geography of Palestine, Palestinians in diaspora. But those are a few cases that I observed in my clinic from Jerusalem and the West Bank. A few examples. First, cases of disordered eating. I call them deliberately disordered eating, not eating disorder, because those young people did not have the body image problem, but their change in the habits of eating and their weight loss and their hoarding of food is a reaction to the weaponized starvation in Gaza. And I saw a few young women during their pregnancy or just after delivering their babies. They come and express feelings of depression, guilt, regret, saying that they feel that they made a mistake to bring young, vulnerable beings to this unsafe world. Colleagues, also, I want to share with you this remarkable 13, 14-year-old boy coming from a Jerusalem school. His mother and teachers wanted him to have methylphenidate to improve his concentration because they thought that he's having ADHD, deliberate ADHD, because he's not paying attention to his classes and there is deterioration in his performance. But this boy explained to me that he deliberately puts his head on the desk and chats with his colleagues in defiance to the decision of his school to accept the imposed Israeli curricula. And his mother was unable to send him to another school in the West Bank because she didn't want him to cross checkpoints. So he stays in his school where the Israeli curricula is imposed, and his only way of showing defiance to this and protest against this is by deliberately not paying attention. I see many parentified children, and this is a strong image of one of them. This is an image from Gaza, where we see a little girl carrying her sibling and taking her to the hospital. But in the clinic, I see young girls and boys whose father is in prison, whose mother is in grief. So they are psychologically absent or physically absent. And the eldest boy or girl would be responsible for the family in their absence. I have observed a few people with suicidal ideation, and I have done a lot of work on suicide, and almost always I could identify a clinical disorder behind the suicidal ideation. But over the past year, I saw a few people with suicidal ideation and no clinical disorder, but they just expressed that they are tired of continuing to live in this nihilistic world. My last example is from one big clinical day that was following the assassination of the Lebanese leader Hassan Nasrallah. And on that day, I saw 16 patients. Most of them are patients who come to see me frequently, and they talk about they come for psychotherapy, and they talk about their personal issues, relational problems, difficulties at university, or difficulties with the workplace. But this time they chose to speak about the impact of the death of the Lebanese leader, who was considered by some of them as a big supporter for Palestinians. And they expressed their grief, their anguish, their fear of the future. This is just a glimpse of my clinical work to show you how the political intertwines with the personal, the psychological, and we can feel that even in our private clinics where we do individual work with people. This is an image from the curricula that is imposed on Jerusalemites, on Jerusalem school kids. And in this lesson, you can read about our new neighbor, Yossi, who comes from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, but he doesn't have friends. The text doesn't say anything about settler colonialism or why this boy would come to Jerusalem and the theft of homes and land that Jerusalemites experience. Here is a quote from Ignatius Martin Barou. Trauma is socially produced. To speak of psychological trauma, of psychosocial trauma, is to emphasize that trauma is produced socially, and therefore that understanding and resolving it require not only treating the problems of individual, but also treating its social roots. In other words, the traumatogenic structures or social conditions. And here you can erase the word socially and write politically to express the situation in Palestine. A few words about the context, the political context in Palestine. So it's a story of land gripping. Palestinians live now on less than 9% of historical Palestine. And this reality has created different Palestinian communities. It caused geographical fragmentation, and it broke the social fabric of the Palestinian community. And in different communities, there are different social and political determinants of health. So when people ask me about the mental health in Palestine, I want a more specific question. Which part of Palestine do you mean? Jerusalem, Gaza, the West Bank? Because there are different conditions that affect the well-being and the health and mental health of Palestinians, including the big indicators. Like if we talk about life expectancy, infant mortality rate, maternal mortality rate, they are different in these different places. But in general, and this data is a little bit old, it belongs to 2019 mainly. Here's some data about the epidemiology of mental health. It has been claimed that among countries in the Eastern Mediterranean region, the country with the greatest burden of morbidity due to mental illness is Palestine. The World Bank says that more than half of Palestinians have depression. Mental illness is a public health issue due to the context of chronic occupation and the exposure to violence. Palestine suffers from fragmentation of services, coherent with the fragmentation of geography. Palestine experiences shortage of mental health personnel. There is a dominance of a biomedical model that pathologizes individuals and ignores both power dynamics and the collective aspects of our experience. NGOs, especially international NGOs, exhibit a misunderstanding of the meaning of neutrality and impartiality. Now, let me share with you a few images that express our experience, the most common experiences in Palestine. First, checkpoints and the psychological impact of the checkpoints. Now, there are 900 checkpoints around the West Bank, 900 checkpoints. And going through them is a suffocating experience that robs us of a lot of time and a lot of energy. And a Palestinian like myself, moving from Jerusalem to the West Bank, and sometimes from one area to another in the West Bank, I spend a lot of time. So much of my energy is depleted before I arrive to my work. And you can imagine a patient coming to see me. They go through the same experience. So this is a very depleting psychological experience for most of us. The other most common experience is political detention. Before October the 7th, the prevalence of political detention from 67 until a couple of years ago was 20%. This means that this experience touches almost 38% of the male population. This means that every family in Palestine experienced political detention. And this is an experience that is very well thought of, very well engineered to result in crushing the individual, especially when it starts with minors, young people, and to inject guilt in the family who fails to prevent this from happening to their children, and to intimidate the Palestinian community. No one has been spared this experience. And usually, torture and maltreatment is very common when people are politically detained. For example, Guantanamo, which has bad reputation. In Guantanamo, 9 people died during detention due to torture and ill treatment over 20 years, over 20 or 25 years. Around 60 Palestinians died in prison, in Israeli prison, Sdei Teman, over the past year. So you can imagine the level of abuse and exploitation and torture people go through. I train on the Istanbul Protocol, and I do a lot of documentation, medical and psychological documentation of the experiences of torture. And what we have observed over the past 15 months since October the 7th is something unprecedented. It's very bad, and it leaves many people with severe psychiatric consequences. The third common experience is massive destruction of homes. While it's unknown that this takes place frequently in Gaza, but also in Jerusalem, also in the West Bank. Home destruction it happens every week, every other day. A home is destroyed, commercial construction is demolished, usually the pretext is this is built without permission, but permissions are not given to Palestinians. So 1/3 of the homes in Jerusalem are threatened to be demolished. So this situation made me argue many years ago that in Palestine, PTSD is not a diagnosis that captures our experience. It can best capture the experience of a soldier who comes to Iraq or to Vietnam or who goes to Gaza to do atrocities, and then they go back to the safety of their homes and they suffer from hypervigilance, re-experiencing. In the threat for them is not real when they are in the safety of their home. Now, in the Palestinian experience, there is no P. We are never in the post. Trauma is repetitive, continuous, chronic. Actually, we are living in a traumatogenic atmosphere. Trauma is everywhere. And it is so huge and it's so prevalent that you cannot distinguish between the personal trauma you go through or the trauma that happened to your brother or to your classmate or to your grandfather or to your father. So it's a traumatogenic atmosphere for everybody. And this image shows you how a 15-year-old in Gaza has gone through 5 wars and excessive atrocities during the March of Return. The unemployment, poverty, food insecurity are very, very high to the point that this affects their brain development. A few words about the current situation. What we observed over the past 15 months in Gaza was unprecedented level of bombardment and home demolition. The bombs that were thrown on Gaza are a few times more than the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 92% of the structures, the building structure in Gaza were demolished. And the health system was particularly targeted, resulting in rendering it dysfunctional in every possible way. All hospitals were demolished. More than 1,000 staff were killed. Doctors were especially tortured, arrested, tortured. 3 of them died under torture. And Mr. Hakak talked about the Lancet paper. Targeting the health system was deliberately done to inflict more killing, more elimination of the Palestinian people. Also, the experience of starvation was unprecedented, especially in North Gaza. Humiliation, massive humiliation touches every individual, and usually textbooks, Western textbooks of psychiatry don't regard the experiences of humiliation as trauma producing. This is the paper from the Lancet, and this was the number, 186,000 killed. This was the number in July 24. So you can imagine by the end of the 15 months, how many more. And people are still dying. People are still dying of hypothermia because they don't have walls and homes. A few words about the Western approach to mental health. So here's the DSM definition of trauma, which talks about physical injury, threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. This is considered to be traumatic. But if a soldier stops you and spits in your face, this is not considered, according to the book, as a traumatic experience. If you are elderly Palestinian man who owns a land of olive trees, and the settlers come and burn all your trees. And an olive tree for a farmer is as dear as his son. This is not considered to be traumatic in the mindset of those who put together the DSM. But I see the impact on people. Humiliation and these kind of aggressions are very, very traumatogenic. The change that is, the damage that is happening to the land surrounding us is very painful. You have probably heard about the word solastalgia, the pain that results from the aggression and the change that is happening to our land. This is something that indigenous people can relate to. And this paper explains that humiliation is the most common trauma in Palestine, and it can cause a psychological assassination for the individual. The WHO has a definition to mental health that does not take into consideration the collective experience. And we know that a collective trauma, colonial historical trauma, does not only damage individuals, but it damages the relationship between individuals, the social fabric. And also this definition can easily make every individual in Palestine sick, because if you are talking about productivity and to make a fruitful contribution to your surrounding, but everything here is orchestrated and engineered to freeze us, to make us frozen in reaction to atrocities. So we have many healthy people. In my opinion, the situation can be best described by a collective trauma. While we have many healthy individuals, they are still suffering against all atrocities to try to be productive and to contribute to their community. But power structures prevent them from doing so. And this cannot be measured by the individual, the usual individual measurement unit that is good to quantify clinical, to assess clinical pathology, clinical psychopathology. So the experience over the past 15 months made me wonder about psychological imperialism and the Western hegemonous ideas in psychology and their applicability in the Palestinian context. And here are a few. The evidence-based positivism, evidence-based science. So NGOs would mandate, international NGOs, that if you want to practice something, it has to be evidence-based. You cannot create the intervention that you believe is relevant to your people. You have to provide evidence. But we are exhausted. We are very few. We are exhausted. We have no means to measure, to provide evidence that what we think is useful for our people, we can provide the donor an evidence that it is useful. So this overemphasis on evidence-based science is canceling our wisdom and dismissing our experience. Most of the Western approach is individualistic, while a colonial trauma damages the social fabric and creates needs that cannot be met by individual therapy. There is also the hedonistic assumption, like if you have anhedonia, this is a symptom of depression or one of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. But anhedonia can be a symptom of political repression and occupation and colonization. There is also overemphasis on the homeostatic approach. You need to go back to the pre-traumatic situation. I don't know if there is a pre-traumatic situation in my lifetime, but I think a Palestinian mental health professional would find liberation psychology more relevant, and the healthy reaction is to challenge power structures that keep producing trauma and suffering and impair the well-being of people. Also, the assumption of ahistoricism and the assumption of political neutrality that we will come to later. But the imposition of the Western approach would result in pathologizing most of Palestinians. Here is a study published in 2018 saying that 80% of children in Gaza suffer from depression. They suffer from political distress, psychosocial distress resulting from the political reality and economic reality. If you use the WHO-5, it cannot distinguish between clinical depression and the psychosocial suffering. So it is easy to look at Palestinians as sick people. And here is another study by the World Bank. And here is a diagnosis for a Jerusalemite woman who watched her home being demolished. And she started crying and shouting. She had a panic attack-like symptom. In reaction, she hyperventilated when she was crying. She was taken to the emergency room in an Israeli hospital. And immediately she was given the diagnosis of emotionally unstable personality and malingering. So it is very easy to pathologize if you ignore the political reality and you don't listen to people's story. Another strange anecdote. This is if I want to hospitalize a patient from Jerusalem, I need to refer them to Kfar Shaul Psychiatric Hospital. But this hospital is built on the land of Deir Yassin, where one of the main massacres against Palestinians took place in 1948. And just opposite to it, the Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum is built. So this spot shows us the oblivion of the Palestinian trauma, complete oblivion to the Palestinian trauma, and the hypermnesia and hypersensitivity to the trauma of the Jews during the European aggression, the European Holocaust. Another example of the over-pathologization. I won't play the video, but this woman, she's an Israeli expert on trauma, Shmuel, Ayelet Shmuel, her name. She's simply saying that the people of Gaza are sociopaths, and she doesn't feel comfortable living a few kilometers from them. She lives in Sderot settlement. And this guy in the middle, this is a story that belongs to 70 years ago. He's one of the leaders of the Algerian Front for Liberation, FLN. And he fought against the French colonialism and was arrested and killed. And the French made believe that he committed suicide. They created a stage and they said that to make believe that he committed suicide. And over 70 years, they denied the claims that they killed him. Just recently, a couple of months ago, Macron confessed that he was killed by the French regime, by the French colonialism. Next to him is Khadr Adnan. This guy became a leader because he launched hunger strike several times in Israel against his administrative detention in the Israeli prison. But last time, I think it was the fifth or the sixth time, last time, Ben-Gvir was in power and he was responsible for prisons. So the man didn't get the necessary medical aid, and he was left to die in his cell. And when he died, an Israeli journalist, Eddie Cohen, wrote that he committed suicide. To talk about suicide and to say that leaders commit suicide is another way to attack their status in the community. So that's another way of pathologizing. They know the mindset of the Algerians or the Palestinians, and it's an accusation that brings together the pathologization and the sin. It is considered, suicide is considered as a sin for people. And it is done deliberately to damage the status of leaders in
when you talk about psychopaths are born. Okay?
So this is how we understand our reality. Let me share with you our approaches to healing our historical trauma. First, let me say a few words about ethics of non-neutrality in psychology and mental health. And here I refer to the stance that mental health professionals should not maintain a stance of neutrality in the face of social, political, and moral issues, especially when these issues directly impact the well-being of individuals and communities. Instead, they should actively engage with and address these broader systemic and structural issues as part of their ethical responsibility. Remaining neutral can sometimes imply complicity with injustice. You cannot be neutral about genocide and can fail to support the best interests of the clients who are affected by these issues. And from that point of view, I challenged the statements that were written by several mental health associations, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Child and Adolescent Psychiatric Associations, in support of the Israelis. They talked about the trauma of October the 7th, while didn't mention anything about the 1 century of historical trauma for Palestinians. And you know, the principles of neutrality and impartiality for mental health has been used repeatedly to hush Palestinians. But I remember attending a global mental health summit in Rome a few years after the attack on Ukraine started. And the conference, now all mental health institutions started speaking about Ukraine, expressing their solidarity with Ukraine in opposition to Russia. And that conference, the Global Mental Health Summit, was inaugurated by a speech from Elena Zelensky. So suddenly it became okay to talk about politics in mental health. Colleagues, given the very small number of mental health professionals, we have been integrating mental health in the community. This is also effective in bypassing, in circumventing stigma and the reluctance of some people to reach highly specialized individuals in mental health. I have been training many doctors, general doctors, and nurses, and pediatricians, and school counselors and teachers. We have been creating a school mental health system and integrating mental health in primary health care, so that only a few percentage of people who need specialized mental health will reach us, but the majority will be treated wherever they are. And this system was effective in Gaza until a few weeks following October the 7th. Everything was crushed completely. only psychiatric hospital, all community mental health centers. My colleagues wrote how they had to go under the rubble to search for antipsychotics for certain patients. 40,000 patients who were well known to this system, they were left in the streets without any kind of support. And every colleague became displaced. We lost tens of colleagues, a few dozens of colleagues were killed, and many of them suffer from their personal grief because they have children who became amputees. So you can imagine the heavy weight. And of course, there are many people there is new suffering and new pool of people who need psychiatric support in Gaza now. We cannot treat what we don't acknowledge. Anthropologist Rosemary Sayer explained, she studied American literature on trauma, what was published in American academia, and she arrived to the conclusion that the Palestinian ethnic cleansing and trauma, historical trauma, is not part of this discussion. It is excluded. And of course, if we don't consider the experiences of Palestinians as historical trauma, we cannot provide appropriate treatment, and we will keep talking about PTSD, which doesn't capture our experience. So one of my colleagues and myself, Zainab Hinawi and I, we drafted this map that explains 1 century of repetitive traumatic experiences, starting from the Balfour Declaration until the promise of Trump to create a Riviera and clean out Gaza. And we explain here that the impact doesn't only affect the individual mind, but it affects the social fabric, creating envy, creating internalization of oppression. The Palestinians become hostile with the weaker members of the society. Feminicide increases. So those observations are related to the damage that is happening to the Palestinian social fabric. We explain that the Palestinian experience can best be understood through the lens of historical trauma, which is colonial, cumulative, collective, and cross-generational. And we argued that we need to move from individual therapy because it is not sufficient and it is not feasible. We cannot put every Palestinian on therapy chair. But we need to incorporate other interventions in therapy, including responding to the negative representations that are created by Palestinians. You know, the genocidal acts that took place in Gaza, they have been paved for by Orientalism and Islamophobia. When false accusations were made against Palestinians, they beheaded babies, they put a child in the oven, they made mass rapes, and the international community was, because of Islamophobia and Orientalism, they were ready to allow this massive aggression to happen to Palestinians. So we need to speak, to narrate our part of truth, and to contribute to the intellectual resistance against all this negative representation that is made for Palestinians. Global solidarity has a very important therapeutic role to heal the collective and historical injustices of the Palestinians. I observed that when the mental health system was crushed in Gaza, our colleagues, our people started grounding themselves and anchoring themselves in spirituality and in their culture, creating their own groups, children singing national songs, women reciting verses from the Quran. I take the humble position of saying, okay, we are not ready for a situation like that. I don't know. At that time, I was the head of mental health services. And I thought that we don't know how to intervene effectively. We need to observe what people are doing and just facilitate that for them. They have created their organic ways of supporting each other. I'll give a few more examples later. Resistance and advocacy play an important role. Healing spaces. In Palestine, we cannot talk about self-care without community care. So this is how we envision a mental health response to mass atrocity in Palestine. In these healing circles and listening groups, participants can reflect, digest, integrate, learn, and transcend. It is there where people can reconnect, relate, and belong. And through this, they can remedy the broken social fabric that is resulting from collective trauma. An example of this, we tried to put all these ideas together and we drafted a model. We published this paper in which we express how we observe that people, young children, use kites. You know, when you are limited in your space, when you cannot move, when you lost family members, when you are displaced, some people spontaneously started flying kites to connect with all these lost things. So we developed a project, a model of a project, Healing Through the Skies, Coping with Grief, through a therapeutic group activity for children in Palestine, where children use kites. We build it on our observation of child songs and children literature that talks about kites and their importance in the Palestinian culture. And an activist from the Philippines made this beautiful illustration for this paper. We observed that people, in reaction to starvation, they distribute seeds and seedlings, and they start planting their own food. This is true in Gaza, but also in reaction to what's happening in Gaza. People in Jerusalem and the West Bank started healing themselves through their relationship to the land. This is an example from the past. It comes from Jenin. If you look closely, you will see that parts of the body of this horse are made of ambulances. We observed the shelling of ambulances in Gaza, but it happened many times previously. This comes from the time of the Jenin invasion in 2002. The grieved children of the people who died there in Jenin massacre, they brought the remnants of shelled cars and ambulances and created this horse to commemorate the resistance of their fathers against the Israeli invasion. Unfortunately, Israel recently confiscated that horse and took it away. People ground themselves in cultural and spiritual concepts. The notion of ribat and sumud became important. We don't have sufficient time to explain these terms. I will go quickly over them. But also here, this article, I'm not sure if it is available in English. It was published in French. It explains how the resistance can be therapeutic when trauma is deliberate and it aims to crush your agency, to freeze people into helplessness. So any act of resistance, and resistance is a very wide spectrum, any act of resistance is an action against this frozen state. So it can be therapeutic for the individual and for the group when it is done in the name of God. And healing justice is a very important concept also. Inviting Netanyahu, who is after the arrest warrants from the ICC, is an act of despise for justice. But justice and the processes of justice are very important for the healing of collective trauma. And we need to be guardians of this and call for healing justice. Also, global solidarity has a very important therapeutic effect. Let me say a few words about solidarity and healing. Solidarity has a healing force. Global support for Palestine is vital in countering oppression and aiding psychological recovery. Solidarity efforts provide hope, recognition, and advocacy for Palestinian rights, strengthening Palestinian resilience, and preventing people from radicalization. When people are isolated and unseen, they will resort to more radical options. Solidarity encourages international responsibility and action. So it is not over. The fight of the Palestinians against erasure will continue, and global solidarity is very important. Healing justice is a framework that combines justice with collective healing of oppressed communities. It's not just about ending occupation, it's about restoring dignity, sovereignty, and self-determination. Healing justice promotes long-term recovery, restores both individual and collective dignity. Let me say my final things that I want to share with you. Palestinians need to generate knowledge from their own experience of trauma. Qualitative research can provide important insights to help refine our conceptual definitions of trauma and delineate relevant psychometric properties. We are open to equal partnership with international researchers who want to help us share understanding from our unique experience. Collective trauma shapes the Palestinian struggle. Solidarity, informed advocacy, and healing justice are essential for trauma healing and a peaceful future. There is so much to learn from Palestine. I want to thank you again for organizing this talk and for listening to me, for your attention, and I hope you will continue your efforts to support Palestinians. The battle is not yet over.